On this episode of Delivering Marketing Joy, we talk with April Dunford, and she tells us how to create context for your customers and why that matters. Well, hey there, and welcome to another edition of Delivering Marketing Joy. I'm your host, Kirby Hausman, and with me today is April Dunford. She's the CEO of Rocket Launch Marketing, but we were just discussing, I say she's the Martha Stewart of positioning, which is pretty awesome.
That's good. Yeah, I like that. Yeah. I'm going to start using that from now on. Martha might come after me and sue me, which is actually terrifying, but okay.
Martha Stewart is a little bit terrifying, but that's cool. So thank you for being on. I appreciate it.
I'm super happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, where I first met you, got introduced to you, I had the chance to see you speak at SKUCon in Vegas, and I really enjoyed the topic. You talked about the importance of setting context for the customer. Can you explain what you meant by that and why it's important?
Yeah, so this idea of context setting is something that I've been spending a lot of time talking to my customers about and folks in general. Is kind of an old marketing concept, the idea of positioning yourself in a market. The problem is that it's not very well understood. So what I mean when I say context setting is when people encounter something that's sort of new that they've never encountered before, they make a bunch of assumptions about what it is based on the context that's around it. And so the example I used in the talk is an experiment that was done by the Washington Post where they put this really famous violin player and they had him play out in front of the subway station. And what happened was nobody noticed that the music was very good or anything special. And he didn't make very much money as a street performer. And yet, that same guy sells tickets for $200 a pop and sells out a concert hall, no problem. And the only real difference there is context. And I think it's an interesting idea to think, why is something super valuable and we're paying for in one context, and in another context, we can't even really understand the value of it, even when it's something as obvious as music and playing a violin outside of a subway station. And so when I talk about this, it's kind of intuitive when I use that example, but when you start thinking about products, the way we set context is largely through who we compare ourselves to and the price we charge for things and the features we choose to highlight and the way we talk about ourselves and what market we choose to position ourselves in. And all of those things go together to help a customer figure out what we're all about. If we do a bad job of that, just like the professional musician in the subway station, people will just make assumptions based on, well, they charge this much and their feature looks like this, and they keep talking about these guys as their customers or their competitors, therefore they must be this. And if we don't do it deliberately, sometimes people make very bad assumptions about what we're all about, or at least assumptions that we don't like. And so as when we're out in the world trying to sell things, it helps to be very deliberate about that positioning.
Yeah. So, and it was one of those things when you kind of went to it, you're like, I always say it's the difference between simple and easy. Right? Like the concept is simple, but it doesn't mean it's easy to execute. So if you're a company or a salesperson or entrepreneur and you're watching this and you want to change the conversation, not only maybe change the conversation, change the price, right? Of your product, you want to change the context. What are some tips? What are some ways that you can do that?
Yeah. So, if we look at how people set context for products, things like price are super important because we see it. I come from the software side of things, and you see it in software. If I'm paying $1 for something, I don't expect to get support. Right. I don't expect it to be very good. There's probably going to be ads because nobody's making any money off $1, and I'll tolerate the ads. If I'm paying $1,000 for something, well, I better be able to pick up the phone and call you and get support. If I, and there better not be any ads on there for $1,000. I expect you to, be operating at a different level. So price is one way to do that. But there's all these other levers we can pull. So one of the most powerful one is to deliberately talk about competitive comparables. So sometimes what we have is, we think about our service or in a particular way. But when people first encounter us, they'll say, oh, you're just like this, and they'll compare you to something else. And once they've made that comparison, it's very hard to back it up and say, no, we're not like that at all. And so one of the examples I give is a company here in Canada that sells these robots that drive around in a manufacturing plant. And, they, for the longest time, they positioned themselves as robots. So they would come in and say, hey, we're robots. And the minute they said robot to folks in a manufacturing plant, they were thinking about, like a mechanical arm that picks up a thing and puts it somewhere. And everything that's cool about their robot is kind of not robot. It's, it's driving around, it's artificial intelligence, it's sensors, it's mapping. And so they decided that it would be better to talk about themselves as self-driving cars. Because the minute they said, well, we're like a self-driving car for a manufacturing plant, then people are comparing you to a car, not a robot. And so they're like, oh, well, of course it drives around. Oh, well, of course it's got artificial intelligence. But there's all the other assumptions you make too, like that sounds hard. That's probably way more expensive than the thing that picks up a bucket and puts it in a box, and it just gave them another way to kind of reframe the conversation around what they do. Now, if you look at how they actually did that repositioning, was more than just changing the way they talked about it. So the industrial design of the robot, they changed it so that it's got little white lights on the front and red lights on the back. And there's no reason for that. Like, it doesn't need lights on it at all. But if they do that, it kind of reinforces this idea, hey, it's like a little car. It's got brake lights. So, and they changed the way they talked about features, for example. Like, if you have a bunch of these things together, they'll call it fleet management because that sounds like cars.
Right.
Instead of, whatever you would call a bunch of robots doing stuff together. I'm not exactly sure. But so I think there's this idea of, if you can somehow explicitly signal that we're like this other thing, then it helps people set context for how they should figure you out. And we do this all the time in tech. We have, like, what's the difference between email and chat? They're kind of the same. And except chat, I expect it to be instant. I expect it to be free. I expect it to maybe have terrible security. There's things that, whereas if I say email, then there's a different expectation there on how it's going to work on my phone and everything else. And yet, most things that are either chat or email, I could call them either one. And so you have to make a decision. Am I chat or am I email? And it kind of depends on what you want people to know about your stuff. If you're not very good at the instant part, then maybe you're email.
I love it. Yeah.
So it's that kind of thing. You have to kind of think about what's special about you, and then what context really makes that shine.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think your one of your slides or your title was like obviously awesome, and I think this topic, it feels like it's obvious, right? Like a lot of, oh gosh, of course I'd be able to tell my USB or whatever. But I feel like a lot of us struggle with this. And so why do you think that we struggle with this? I mean, how do we break out of it?
Yeah. I've been head of marketing at a bunch of different startups, and it took me a long time to figure this out, like way longer than you would think. and I think part of the problem is that we get too close to our own products and our own offerings.
Yeah.
And so we get used to thinking about them in a certain way, and we kind of just assume that that's the only context we could put around these things. Right. So we'll say, another example I give in the talk is this company that I worked with, and it was founded by a couple of guys with PhDs in database technology, and the thing they built was a database. And we just never conceived of the fact that it could be anything else until we had a customer actually say, you know what, you're not a database, you're this other thing. And it was amazing to me that and I was fairly new at the company, I'd only been there a month, it really struck home to me how much assumptions we bring with us about our own stuff.
Right.
And so I think the big thing we have to do is kind of be able to take a step back and say, pretend I've never encountered this thing before. Pretend, this is the first time I'm looking at it. And, what do I want someone to notice about it? Mm-hmm. And given that, what should the context be? And a lot of that has to do with really, preserving your kind of child's mind, like let's pretend we're not all experts on this and we haven't been sitting in a room thinking about this for the last 5 years. and say, okay, if I was to encounter this and describe this to someone that has no clue, how would we do that? And I think that's hard for us as people, just human beings. I think we don't operate like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think it's one of those things where once you pick a lane, it's hard in anything, right? It doesn't have to be business. It could be politics or child rearing or whatever. So once you've decided something, you don't want to redecide it. So no, that's super helpful stuff, April. I really appreciate you taking the time, and you've answered my 3 questions. So I give everybody a chance to ask me a question. Do you have one for me?
Well, yeah, I do have a question for you.
Okay.
So I was looking back at the podcast and how many episodes you've done and all the people you've talked to, and I was also at a conference this week where the track that I was speaking in was called aha moments.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And so the question I had for you was, you get to sit there and talk to all of these super smart people with their great advice. And I'm wondering, was there ever, what was your biggest aha moment where you had a guest on that was talking about a concept or a thing around delivering marketing joy that really had an impact on you, that you went, whoa, I never thought about that. Hang on. And it kind of had a big aha. Did you ever have a big aha moment on the podcast? And what was that? I was curious to hear what that was.
That's a great question. And the cool thing about it, April, is I think, and I'm not going to chicken out and not answer, but one of the things that I would say is it's challenging to answer because there have been actually quite a few. So one of the things...
I can imagine.
Yeah, because we really do. I get the opportunity. I treat it like a class. I get the opportunity to speak to really smart people every week, and so that's cool. The one I reference this one a lot, but only because I think it's one that we all can hear again and again. I was really early on in doing this podcast when I had the opportunity to speak with Seth Godin, who wasn't yet on the show. I got him later, but he had just said he had seen it. And it was like a little bit of a wow moment that he'd actually seen it. And he said to me, keep doing it. In 3 years, you'll be glad you did. And at that episode, it was like 20, right? And I didn't have the next week lined up. And so it was a great piece of motivation to say that if you're going to do content, if you're going to go down the path of trying to do something like this, that it's not a 3-month commitment, right? Yeah. So Seth Godin is a 3-year commitment. And then the other piece is probably just, there've been a bunch here recently where people have talked a lot about whether it's context setting or changing the way we look at what we do from our industry, whether it's from events, experiences, changing the way we converse about it. There have been a bunch of those little moments here lately where I'm like, oh, I need to go back to the drawing board. And you mentioned it in your talk where you're like, you got to get rid of all the stuff you used to think you did, and rethink about it. And so there've been a lot of little ones here lately that have kind of reshaped the way I think about what I do. And those are cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, April, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate you doing it. We'll have to do it again sometime, okay?
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Absolutely. Well, that's going to wrap up this edition of Delivering Marketing Joy. We'll see you next time.